I have an interesting conversation with Gemini I wanted to walk through today. So, this will be going on my retro channel, but it's a lot around the use of ChatGPT, well, not ChatGPT in this case, Google Gemini, but large language models, and generating code. And in particular, so one of the things I've been doing as sort of a hobby for retro programming is learning Basic 09, which is a variant of Basic that was specific to Microware's OS 9, which is an operating system and the language that I think started around 79, but certainly was a early platform that was created. It was targeting Motorola's 6809 processor, which is one of the 8-bit processors from the 1970s, and implemented in a number of different systems, but probably the most successful one was the Tandy Coco. Anyway, one of the downsides about trying to use like a modern code editor, and in this example it's VS Code, is the highlighting that you get. Well, you don't get highlighting. The languages that are supported in something like VS Code are all sort of modern, popular languages. So you can find code highlighting for, say, JavaScript or Python or even Visual Basic, probably. But because Basic 09 has its own particular syntax, and it's not, it's got some, it's kind of like a marriage between sort of what would be the Microsoft Basics. Basic was a language that was created is intended as a way to kind of help people back in when home computers were brand new, and people were learning about how to use them. Programming was very core for early computers, and so Basic was used as a language to help people learn how to program for a computer, but not have to write their code in a way that the computer understands. So very roughly, a computer operates using what's called machine code, which is essentially the handful of operations all around, well, mostly the way a computer operates, the way the computer is designed, and this goes back to the early days of computing, so the 1950s in particular, probably 40s and 50s, and even the ideas that kind of came around that time were all based on the way that adding machines worked. So mechanical calculators, essentially. They would have, some of the more advanced ones would have one or more registers, and a register is essentially a physical storage spot where you can store numbers in. Anyway, once we moved into analog and digital computers, that concept of registers still exists even today, and it's how the computer processor stores information and performs operations on those registers in memory. And so there are a handful of commands that are called that make up what's machine language, which allows you to, say, pull. So registers are like high-speed memory access that are the fastest memory that a processor can have access to, and that's where all the real heavy lifting is done. Then you can also have RAM, which is where information can be stored to be pulled into registers and then pushed back out. The results can be pushed back out, and it's still fairly high speed, but not as fast as a register. And then you have storage, which would be hard drives, floppy drives back in the day, CD-ROMs, that sort of thing. And those are far slower and generally are used for like persisting information. RAM and registers will clear when you turn your computer off. So the higher level programming languages were meant as a way to sort of abstract that machine language, and there is a slight abstraction called assembly language, which is writing instructions in a way that the computer thinks, you would be writing in something like assembly generally. But again, that's really technically challenging and not certainly user-friendly for somebody who doesn't understand what a computer is and how it works. So that's where BASIC comes in. But BASIC's fairly limited, and especially the early BASIC languages were called interpreted languages, which means that you would write all your source code be in BASIC, and then as you ran it, it would basically, the computer would translate that into something more like machine language on the fly as it was reading through the BASIC language itself. BASIC 09 has an advantage of performance where it has this ability to do, you can do what's called packing, where it essentially sort of creates what's called I code, which is sort of an intermediary code between the source language and what would be assembly or machine language. And it runs a lot faster because of that. It's very similar to what Java did when Java came around in the 1990s. It had its own sort of version of that intermediary step where it would still be, it could be interpreted, but it would be a little bit faster. Anyway, I don't really need to go down that too far. My purposes for this video, though, is to show how I used a large language model, and again, in this case, Gemini, to generate that grammar I need to be able to get syntax highlighting in BASIC. In particular, I was targeting VS Code. VS Code, the way that it works for language support is it uses another, I think this is open source, but it's certainly a public open technology called TextMate. I'm not sure if language is the right term, but it's essentially all based off of what's a JSON file. So JSON is JavaScript object notation. It's just a syntax for writing a file that allows you to sort of structure it and create attributes and objects and sort of organize your data. And the key mechanism for this file is using regex, or regular expression. And that's a very standard sort of syntax that allows you to do pattern matching on strings. So that's the preamble. So going into this, I started this, and within 24 hours, I went from knowing nothing about TextMate and how to write the grammar or how to build a file to what is pretty much a fully functional highlighting TextMate grammar for BASIC 09 that I now have installed in my VS Code, and now I have highlighting. And that's the power of large language models. So that's the purpose of this video, is for me to kind of walk through the conversations. And I did it all in one Gemini conversation from beginning to end. And I also, the only inputs that I started with was my BASIC 09 only reference document, which is, I've covered this on some of my other retro channel videos, and I've got a link to this specific document I'll put in the description on one of my GitHub projects that you can go and grab it yourself if you want. But so all I did was I started off my conversation by linking that document, so uploading it to Google Gemini into a new conversation and saying, I want to create a TextMate grammar for BASIC 09 using this manual. And again, this is one of the, if you're trying to use a large language model for a modern, either a language or technology like TextMate, it's pretty fluent in most of the modern tools and technologies that are out there. I don't think I'll probably go into full detail of everything, but I will. It is a very lengthy conversation. Let's begin. So I said I want to create a TextMate grammar for BASIC 09 using this manual, and the manual is attached. And so this is the first part of the conversation. So it just basically gave me a summary of the contents of that document, saying it was sufficient. So it below is the organized list of keywords, operators, constants, and syntax patterns categorized to help you define the scopes. So keyword control, storage type, constant numeric, string quote double. Those are examples. But basically, you have to do your keywords and storage, your constants, your variables. There's a whole bunch of different stuff that I'll go into as we go through this. But okay, so it showed me some declarations. So procedures, params, types, end isn't really a declaration. I think I moved that into something else. And dims. Those are your sort of your declarations, because you can have a procedure. Inside of a procedure, you can have a type. You can have types, dims, and params. So in Basic 09 language, a type is kind of like a struct, where you can create a more complex structure. In the terminology of Basic 09, I think they're called matrices or vectors, depending on the size of them. And then dims are basically variables, and params are variables that are passed into the procedure from when the procedure is being called. So they're essentially parameters to your procedure. Conditionals, loops. So this is all basic language. So you've got your if, then, else, end if, for, to, step next, while, do, end while, repeat until, loops, end loops, exit if, end exit, go to, go sub, return. These are all sort of the basic language parts. And then we had data types. So these are your different data types: byte, integer, real, string, boolean. You've got your operation assignments. And again, kind of ignore the, like, that's not a data type. That's more of a declaration. You have your operators. So we want to do highlighting for the assignment operators, which by Basic 09 includes both equals, which is common amongst all the early basics, and then colon equals, which I believe it borrows from Pascal, which was another sort of introductory language to teaching people how to program. That was kind of supplanted the basic in university education. Certainly when I was in university, I learned Pascal in addition to some C and some assembly. So those are the operator symbols. So that's doing your logic of less than, equal to, greater than, multiplication, division, addition, subtraction, logical operations like and, not, or XOR. And then some built-in functions. So there's a bunch of mathematical functions for things like sine, cosine, square root, log, all that sort of stuff. Type conversions, to be able to convert values from one type to another. String functions to do string manipulations, so getting a character from a number or substringing either the left, right, or middle of a string, that sort of stuff. Some memory addition, so memory manipulation, so you can pull information in and out of memory, that sort of stuff. And then some constants as well. And then there's I/O, so you have reading from, which would be your input, either from screen or from file. Print, which would be writing out to the screen or out to file. Open, close for file opening and closing. Read, write, more sort of similar. This is more input, output is more for screen generally. Read, write would be more for pulling from files. And then it started giving me some things like comment, what was this for? You need regular. So this is identifying where you're going to need to find regular expressions for certain patterns. So you're going to need regular expressions to be able to find comments for both line comments and block comments. Although there are no block comments in Basic 09, but there are sort of comments like the REM or the exclamation point, sort of a shorthand for REM, which comments everything to the end of the line. Or you can have open parentheses, star, then star, close parentheses as a comment out this block of text. So it gave me a bunch of that. And then I asked, how do I take what you've generated and add a language to VS Code? So that's where it started to give me some stuff I needed to install. So I needed Yeoman to set up my project, which I installed. And I'm doing all of this on Ubuntu on Windows 11. So it's a version of Linux running as a sort of a subsystem under Windows 11, because my main computer is a Windows 11 computer presently. So I installed Yeoman, And then I got Yo to generate a project using Yo code. I filled in pretty much what it asked me. This wasn't exactly what I used. There were a couple extra fields that I had to fill in, but it sort of walked me through well enough so that I got my project created, and then that project created a file under a subfolder of syntaxes called basic09.tm language.json. And I will provide a link as well in the description to my GitHub project that houses all of the end result of this. So if you wanted to grab this and try it out yourself, if you wanted to learn Basic 09, I will make that available in the video description as well. So then it said create the TextMate grammar. So this is where we start filling out the JSON document. So this is the basic structure of a TextMate grammar document. So the key thing is that you have your sort of global patterns, and these are all essentially links to parts in the repository. Those are the two key parts of a TextMate document. You have your pattern, your global patterns, which say here's all the patterns that are available in this document, and the order in which they appear here are the order in which they'll be executed. So higher priority stuff is listed higher, and then lower priority goes further down. This is not what you'll see in the actual document because this is just the first pass, but just to kind of walk through how this works. And then after that, you have a repository. So a repository will have an entry for every pattern that's mentioned up here. So this hashtag comment says that you're going to find in the repository a section called comments further down below, and in fact that's where this is right here. And then keywords you can see is down here, and then operators, data types, strings, numbers, and so on and so forth. And then within each one of those patterns, it has its own sort of, this becomes a little bit recursive in that you have patterns within the specific pattern, and it tells me I'm looking for a comment line, and this is the regular expression pattern to find a comment line. In this case, it's looking for the REM as a whole word, so there's no alphanumeric characters before or after the 3 letters of REM, and then any number of characters afterwards. And then the next thing, the other pattern that can be matched, so that's a comment, a line comment, and then there's a block comment, which again, probably not fully correct. This probably should just be another line comment, now that I think about it, but I think that's actually how it is in the output. Anyway, I don't want to give the impression that my full result at the end of this conversation is 100% bug-free. There probably are some minor things, but it does 99% of the work that I want, and I will make any minor adjustments to it after the fact. For a block comment here, it's looking for the pattern of the parentheses star. And it tried to do curly brace star, which is not valid, so I pulled that out at some points. But basically, that's how this works. And then inside of that, it includes a comments. Oh, so you can find comments within comments, I think is how that works. And then here with keywords, we've got a few different matches. So we've got control. This is where we've got our if, then, else, and if for two-step next. Then we have our storage modifiers, which it's saying our procedure end param type and dim. Again, end isn't really one of those. I moved that up into keywords, I think, when I fixed this up. And then, yeah, it just kind of, so we got operators is the next. So that's where we've got our colon equals. We've got our arithmetic operators, logical operators. Then we've got our types. So that's our data types. So that we have, because it supports bytes, integers, reals, strings, and booleans. I don't know if there's any other ones, but I think that's pretty complete. And then strings, so there's a special pattern for handling strings, although generally a string is, as long as it starts with a quote and ends with a quote, everything else inside is treated as one uniform piece of highlight, because it's a string. It's not actual logical code. Numbers are treated differently. Again, numbers and hexadecimal values as well, because you could have a hexadecimal value is a number if you're dealing with hex values. In fact, that's what it says, hex. Real could have exponents or decimal places. Integers are just digits. Line numbers are just digits as well, and they capture the actual line number, and that can be used. I don't think I do anything with it, but that's the only difference there. Okay, and then it says to test it. So, and these instructions were basically correct. So, I had this project that got created by Yeoman open in VS Code, and then when I hit F5, it would open a debug VS Code window that actually uses the TextMate highlighting in this file as the highlight for anything I open up in that sort of debug VS Code window. So that was how I set up my sort of testing environment, and from there I used I opened up one or two. I have some pretty complicated basic 09 source code files, and I used one or two of them that seemed to kind of capture everything that I needed, because it was doing file I/O and read writes and all sorts of, and very complex types and dims and params, and it was what I used to serve as my test base. And then it gave me instructions on publishing, which I didn't get to until I actually was happy with the final product. And then I did this install as well, but it did give me a whole instructions of what I needed. Okay, and then the first thing that I noticed was I started getting some warnings when I did the install of VCSE. It was complaining about my node being too out of date, so I had to upgrade from 18 to 20. So it just gave me a quick little step on how to do an upgrade, which I did. I installed NVM because I didn't have NVM on, which is like a node version manager, and then I added installed version 20 and then switched to that as my default. So now let's skip ahead to this. If I make changes to the TextMate JSON file, do I just press F5 to update? Also, is pressing F5 permanent? So this is where I was still not clear. I haven't, especially with working with a TextMate file, I'm not as familiar with VS Code. Actually, VS Code's certainly not the IDE that I have the most hours with. I've used a lot of JetBrains IDEs. So WebStorm in particular is one that I've used quite a bit of, and I've used other ones in the past, but I have used VS Code because it's free and it does work pretty well. But this is one aspect of VS Code I wasn't so as familiar with, so I did ask it to, a couple of questions about how do I make this permanent, and so then it showed me how to make it permanent by doing the VSCE stuff as well again. I think this is duplicated from what was above. But anyway, so once I was kind of happy with my environment set up and I got my initial JSON document copy and pasted basically from what they gave me in that one that we went over, I said, okay, there's some issues. So now I could see, because I was looking at the highlighting of my source code and I saw that it didn't properly match what I was expecting. There were a lot of the text in the source file was still gray, essentially. Was showing that it wasn't being highlighted at all. It hadn't been followed by patterns. So that's where I started working through the process. What did I say here? So I said REM and exclamation should supposed to be highlighted and come with the rest of the line. I think they actually were just with comments as far as the default for highlighting in VS Code. It looks very similar to an unhighlighted, non-parsed piece of text. But in either case, that was my workflow going forward. Was I didn't want it to, and this is just general for any sort of debugging. It was, you don't try and fix everything all at once. You isolate down to one or two things, work on those and get them until they're working, and then move on to the next thing. And so that's the workflow for the rest of this conversation. All right. Let's skip down. So they even gave me some updated text. So sometimes what I would do is I would just copy and paste this right in, replacing the section. So this was the comment section I replaced. And okay, so now I came to the next one. So here, I found a number of symbols that weren't being highlighted. So the equals on its own wasn't being highlighted, colons weren't being highlighted, semicolons, backslash, hash, greater than, less than. So then it added punctuation. So it gave me an operators one, or at least it updated it. That may have been in the original one, but in either case. So it gave me my patterns for keyword operators. It gave me the assignment operator of just colon equals, but then I think I added in manually the or and then just equals, because either of those are valid in Basic 09. Punctuation separators, so that would be the backslash or semicolon. Gave me a delimiter, which was the colon, and then logical operators, so not, and, or, XOR, logical and, logical or, logical XOR, logical not, mod, div, two-step. I don't want to get too lost in the weeds, because like I said, if you see some of these that don't look quite right, chances are they've got fixed further down, so I'm not going to stop on those too much. And then it says, it gave me a little bit of a description. So again, it was the value of using this model was that it didn't just write the code for me, but it helped teach me how to better understand how TextMate works. So it said TextMate grammars process patterns sequentially by ensuring your JSON structured document looks like this. So you've got our patterns, comments, strings, keywords, operators. The regex engine will successfully identify and skip all the contents of strings and comments, only allowing the patterns in your new operators block to match the remaining code. So again, it does comments and strings, and then once, if it takes, the ways of the, at least my understanding now of how TextMate works is it'll start with the first pattern and then run through the whole document looking for matches on that pattern. And if a block of text matches a pattern in an earlier, like a higher up pattern, it will not parse that same block again further down. And that ended up being, as I was building out for a full language support, my pattern started to get more complicated. But that's the basic premise. So you put your stuff that's, you know, like a comment, anything that's inside of a comment isn't going to be highlighted because it's treated as a block of comment or a block of a string. So you don't need to reparse it looking for symbols or variable names, that sort of stuff, because it's being treated as a string. And then, so that's kind of the basic philosophy. And then it also said, remember to use the developer reload window when you make changes. So then I said, okay, here's the next one. So I wasn't getting highlighting of these hash symbols, and these are kind of special with OS 9 where this is the name of the variable, but because you're doing I/O and you have to put a hash in front of it, that's sort of just the special syntax for operations like the built-in functions like put or print, and the thing that follows a hash can either be a variable name or it can be a literal. In the case of the literal, like print hash 2, OS 9 has a multiple terminal windows. So this is saying, and even device windows actually. So your number 2 is printing out, I think, to a specific terminal. 0 and 1 it might be special cases, but I guess I'm still kind of learning Basic 09, but that's basically the difference. You can have a hash that either references a variable afterwards or it can be a literal. So then it gave me, it removed the hash from operators, because I think that's the only place the hash is used is in this particular logic. So that got pulled out of the operators and it got added to a new pattern called I/O handles, and that's where you have and again, this got built up because my you want hash variable name. The variable name should be colored one way, but a hash literal, the literal should be colored differently because literals and variables should have separate colors to sort of distinguish between the two. And again, that's not what we see here, but I definitely know that's what's in the end result. So. And then it said to add that new pattern, because we've added a new pattern to our repository called I/O handles, we have to put it in here someplace. And I think this got bumped further down the list because I didn't want it was interfering with some of the other parsing as we got down into here. Here were some other literals. So Boolean true and false values are not highlighted. So we ended up, and pi is another literal. So these are sort of, they should be treated essentially the same as numbers, but they are even though it's text. So these got added into constants as a pattern, and we added in all the ones that are, and I think there's only the 3, true, false, and pi, that are literals, that are non-numeric literals in Basic 09, but again, I'd have to go back to the manual to make sure. Again, because I gave it the reference manual that does document all of what is valid syntax in Basic 09, it was able to kind of pick out most of this, and if it did make a mistake here and there, not the big worst thing in the world, because I had my source code I could see, and we kind of refined it as we went. But the vast majority of the solutions it gave me were either right or mostly right, and they just needed a little tweaking. Okay, so then I said IO commands are not highlighting. So open, close, print, get, and seek. So I had a number of the commands were highlighting, but those ones specifically weren't. I could see in my source code. So then it said you need to define them as distinct sets of keywords in your grammar. So we created an IO statements block and added those in. So these are all the ones that deal with input output. So open, close, create, seek, input, print, read, write, get, put, poke, and poke. Oh, peek should be in there too, but again, I expect it got fixed. Okay, verify means pattern array, and then we added in into IO statements after constants. Oh, and then I said, well, shouldn't that just be a new section of keywords, because there already was a keywords pattern? And it said, yes, defining IO commands in a dedicated IO statements section is the correct and best practice for TextMate grammars, rather than mixing them in with the general keyword section. Here's why. It improves semantic scoping. The primary goal of a TextMate grammar is semantic scoping, assigning a detailed identifier to each piece of code. By separating them, users can color a theme that assigns different color to control flow versus IO operations. Oh, I see. So that's all that it was distinguishing between IO versus sort of control logic, that I could actually color code them differently. So that's, again, I'm still learning as I'm doing this, but that was its reasoning for why it put it in a separate section. And if you put it all in one massive list, it becomes harder to read and debug. So separating them into logical groups makes it easier to ensure you haven't missed a keyword or used a conflicting scope. Okay. And then I said, what about math functions, type conversion functions, string functions, and system memory functions? So that's, if we go back up a little bit here into that first table it gave me, that's where I was pulling this from. So there were a number of these that weren't highlighting, so math functions weren't coming up. A few of these weren't, so that's where I went back down. Yeah, here. Okay, so then it went and gave me some more suggestions. Okay, then I said, I saved my changes and reload the window, and many of my changes are now showing. There were a few still not working correctly, though. So now I said, run isn't highlighting correctly. Because if you want, so in Basic 09, if you want a procedure to call another procedure, the way you do that logically is by using the run command. So you would say run and then procedure name, and then pass in any parameters that you want if it's got parameters, or you just run the procedure. And then functions with a trailing $sign, like right dollar and left dollar, are not highlighting. So that one was more about the string manipulations, the way that the function name that's built into the language is spelled is that these end with a $sign. So for the run one, it just added it into the list of system language ones. So these are all ones that allow you to sort of manipulate the stuff that's running in memory. And then the trailing ones, the problem was that we didn't have I can't remember if it actually had this or it missed it, But in either case, I do believe the reason why it failed was because of this trailing backslash B. So the two backslashes is just, the first one's just the escape, because backslash is a reserved regex character. If you want to have a backslash in the actual expression, you have to escape it with another backslash, which is why you'll see double the backslashes everywhere. But the backslash B is essentially saying this is the end of a alphanumeric block of text. So anything that's not either A to Z, lowercase, capital, or numbers 0 to 9 is not considered part of that. But because $ is, I want $ in the case of these functions to be treated as part of the block of text to be highlighted, I had to remove that. In fact, that's where it's, so it gave me this, but it didn't catch that. So that's where I came up with here saying these are my current JSON snippets. So I did have here. So it did have the // but it was, this was the problem thing. So again, sometimes it doesn't, if it doesn't give me the right answer, I could give it the examples of, well, here's exactly what I have, and this is, and I'm not seeing what you're telling me I should be seeing. And so then it came back and said, you're right, the issue isn't your JSON structure, but how the TextMate's regular expression handler word boundaries. Oh yeah, so the / is a word boundary token when combined with a non-word character like the $. So it said the key is that we have to remove that essentially. So you can see here, it removed that /B at the end. And this was just me asking, won't that remove catching a non-$ symbol in pattern matching? Because of how we structured the regex, it will still work as intended. It was right, it did work. So I was just, this was me kind of clarifying, isn't that kind of necessary? But no, it wasn't, so that's okay. Because the only symbol it was looking for that wasn't alphanumeric was the $. Anything else that did come after didn't get caught up in the matching, so it was not a problem. In fact, it gave me a little blurb about saying how it works. So again, it was helpful in sort of educating me. Again, regex is common across tons of languages. This is a universal sort of syntax for string manipulation. Any modern language in particular pretty much uses the regex syntax for doing string. There's usually a regex function built into most programming languages these days that just handles the exact same syntax. In fact, if you go to, I think it's regex.io, where you can test your regex pattern, it'll show, and then give it sample text, and it'll show you what matches, what doesn't, that sort of thing. But you know, for me, I don't use regex on a daily basis, so whenever I'm writing regex code, what I do find myself doing is looking up online and getting it, or in this case now, using a model to kind of do it, and I just test. Okay, all right, so then that one fixed that issue, so then I moved on to the next one. So here, I was getting a lack of syntax highlighting in some of these symbols, so types and dims, and then also in these seq lines. So again, it gave me, because I had a separate parsing pattern for data types, and for these ones, these are more, so this would be an IO pattern, and this one would be sort of logical operations. So this is, even though I was having symbols not matching, I would need different solutions for these different parts of the TextMate definition. So there's one part of the TextMate doc that deals with types and dims, there's another that deals with the seq, and there's another that deals with the if-then. But that's what I was saying, not showing. And then it gave me some options to kind of make changes. And it also said, because we added a delimiters, we added that into the patterns as well. And then I said, is there a way to separately highlight procedure, param, type, and dim variable names? So this is the next thing. So I wasn't getting these highlighted either. So that was the next thing that we worked on. And again, it gave me some implementation steps. And then we added in field access and declarations. And then I said param should be treated similar to dim, so then we just added param. So param had been in a different pattern, and we just added it into one, so it's dim or param. Because other than the fact that you're using, the only difference between a dim and a param, at least as far as I understand, is that the param it simply says that this variable, instead of being defined within the parameter or within the procedure, it's being passed in. But otherwise, the syntax, I believe, is identical. Okay, so then we get some issues here. Oh, so this is where the procedure didn't highlight, but that's more to do with the default coloring for the way VS Code highlights procedure names versus variable names. It treats them differently. It does purple sort of by default for procedure names, whereas variables and other things are in yellow by default. Now, I could change that myself if I go into VS Code, but that's not really the purpose of. So maybe there's a good little aside. So TextMate tells the Visual Studio Code or any product that supports TextMate as a grammar language, how the different parts of the text that it's looking at are broken into, like I said, into the different sort of components of the language. But the coloring that are chosen for each of those bits, like data types versus functions versus variables, those are defined outside of TextMate. They're defined within the IDE. So if I want to change the coloring, I would do that in VS Code separately from the TextMate. Okay, which was out of the scope of this work. But I did see that some of the other parts weren't being highlighted, so then we had to get in further into the weeds on some of the logic for this. Yeah, so you can see particularly type started to get complicated. So with type, we started getting the type keyword, and then the type name, and then what the value of the type is equal to. And then from there, you could include data types, because a type has essentially a number of fields, and each of those fields could also have subfields, so they could be their own sort of type. So we can get quite complicated. So that's where we start to get some recursive pattern matching, that it starts looking at the type and breaking down the highlighting up until where it starts to be assigned to what that type is defined as, and then the definition part gets sort of reparsed using these patterns, and so on and so forth. And then dim and param, similar sort of thing. A dim and a param, especially when you're dealing with where you can have multi-line or multi-definitions of dims on the same line, that sort of thing. Again, the language can get quite complicated, so this starts to build up. And then this was me just asking why I was getting inconsistent results, and it gave me some more suggestions. Because then we went back to data types. If this does exist, but the issue seems to be that it only works when the given type value is the last non-white space value on the line. Okay, yeah. So this was where I get like the very last type value was highlighted, but everything before it wasn't. So this is where I was starting to get pattern matching, but the whole thing wasn't working. And so that was kind of the back and forth, this conversation, where I would ask it for a change. It would give me the change. I'd put that into my JSON file, or update my JSON file, and then hit F5, or Control R actually, on the debugger VS Code window to refresh. Control R is just rerun the last command, the developer command, essentially, in VS Code. So I'd refresh my developer window, see what got changed. I didn't get exactly what I want, so then I would describe to it, and I would use the coloring sort of as an indicator to say this is white, this is yellow. Again, doesn't matter what the specific colors were, other than it does help kind of help it understand. I expect it probably understands what the default color scheme is in VS Code, so it could kind of understand what type of pattern matching was being affected. But this was sort of the back and forth, was that it would suggest a change, I'd implement the change, refresh my window, and then if I didn't get the results I was wanting, I'd describe the results that I saw, and that often helped it discover how to make a change to the process. And that was the back and forth throughout this whole process, pretty much. So then it gave me some updates. Yeah, and just to give you an idea of how long this conversation is, we are now at just less than a third of the full scroll window. So I'm going to go over this really briefly. I'm definitely not going into detail on every single change. But let's get down here a little more. So then we move on. Once I figured out that problem, we then move on to the next one. So here was, a more complex type, and then I said, okay, so currently that's not highlighted, that's not being highlighted, this isn't being highlighted, and so that was where they're not being highlighted because they're being consumed by the broader type begin pattern and or skip by its intervals. So that's where we started adding in patterns, so that once we got past the type declaration, we then would have patterns where we would include another one that's in the repository. So data types, because I wasn't referencing data types inside of the patterns that are being parsed on the line where it discovered a type, it wasn't highlighting any of the data type, not the data types, the punctuation ones. So anyway, that was kind of the back and forth. Is that as I would discover, especially for, like I said, for something as complex as a line as something like a type, where you can really have a long string of variable names and syntax and separators and all sorts of different things, that you had to make sure that the patterns within the type declaration would then go out and call from the repository. It's this combination of, you want to have all of the logic for the same type of symbol in a pattern within the repository, but then you might have to nest that pattern, a call to that pattern, from another pattern in the repository if you have this sort of complicated part of the language. So, oh, and this was another good little point. This would be the one annoying thing that was useful in the fact that it was sort of describing what was happening, but comments are not legal JSON. So every time I would copy and paste this, I'd have to edit out all these comments, either both the full line comments and the end of line comments, before I could even test it. And this started to get annoying by the time I was about, like I said, a third of the way down this conversation chain. So I asked it to please leave those out. That's not valid JSON syntax. So it started to do that, although still, I found it creeping back in occasionally. This is one of those things where a model will try to follow your instructions, but for whatever reason, sometimes it doesn't. So sometimes I had to remind it, and it did. As we got down the conversation, it seemed to get better. It didn't do it nearly as much, but again, if you see it doing something that you don't like, just tell it, don't do this thing, and it will usually adjust. So now you can see the next one has no comments, so I can just hit copy code and then paste it in, just find the section that I'm declaring that I'm replacing and do it, or just highlight the section that I want to replace and copy it and paste it and keep moving. So it sort of helps speed up the process. So again, it's trying to be helpful, but it was more time wasting. I didn't need that sort of description within the code itself. I'd rather it be within the text outside of the copy and paste source. So then we said, okay, now I see a few more issues. So type logic seems to be bleeding over to the next line. So this was where it wasn't terminating by a new line. It was actually would go bleed over to the next line, and so even if I had two types, one above the other, the second type would be colored wrong because it was still interpreting it as part of the previous type. So that was a fix that we had to do. All the fields and subfields are correct, but valid data types like byte, boolean, and integer in this example are also yellow, so it wasn't color coding the data types correctly. So then it said, okay, so the scope bleeding was because we didn't have a scope bleeding issue, so it fixed that. And then color fix was because it was the ordering of the data types. So we moved data types up to the top, and we had the end pattern so that it looked for, so it should stop the first type thing when it finds either a new line or a backslash, because a backslash allows you to concatenate multiple logical lines multiple expressions on the same source line, and we would want it to reparse to parse that next block as a new line, even though it's all inline. So then data types got moved up, and same sort of thing with dims and params too, because I think it was bleeding there as well. All right, so that fixed those issues. Numeric literals and the strings arrays were not highlighting, so that was another one. Let me see, did I give an example here? No, but I do one here though, I think. Yeah, so these weren't highlighting correctly. They should be highlighted as literals, but they weren't. So that was another thing that we added in, which would have been right here. So if it found a open square bracket and then a numeric value and then a closed square bracket, any number of numbers in between, it treated that middle part as a constant numeric. So this is another thing that TextMate does, is that it's very prefix. It uses the prefix names to kind of define how the highlighting should be done. So constant numeric is interpreted by the IDE, like VS Code. That's how it decides what coloring to assign. And then the stuff that comes after you can use to sort of more specify for your own purposes. You can, in fact, I think you could take, like for instance here, you've got storage modifier. So VS Code will only look at storage modifier and use that to do the coloring, but Basic 09 is sort of your own added suffixes that you can throw in to sort of, if you wanted to be specific between maybe different types of storage modifiers. And I think you can even use that to color code differently within, if you want a custom color code within VS Code for the particular language that you're looking at. So then we moved on to dim param logic. So again, same sort of problem. We didn't have literals and arrays highlighting, and variable names in dim param statements aren't highlighted. And I gave some examples. And then it gave me some updates. All right. And then it said it fixed that, but the variable names weren't done. And then we did the fixes there. Okay, I think I'm getting close to being done talking about this. I'm just going to kind of scroll down through this and see if there's anything that's kind of sticks out to me. But I do, if I can share this conversation, I hope Gemini has the same possibility as ChatGPT, that I can share a conversation. I will also add that link to the description of this video, just so you can kind of read through this if you are so interested in getting into the weeds on this. But I think I've kind of covered my how this works kind of thing. Because yeah, basically all I was doing was for each one of these, so base wasn't being highlighted correctly, on error wasn't being highlighted correctly, and for some odd reason for the on error it wanted to, I'm not quite sure why, it wanted to treat on error as one logical unit, because in the reference manual, on error go to or go sub is valid, but so is on and then variable name go to or go sub. So on and error should be treated separate. So that was a bit of a back and forth that we had, which I guess I didn't fix right away, but I do fix it later through. Oh yeah, so then I had my highlighting working on the declarations for dims and params and types, but if that same variable was referenced later on in the source code, that wasn't being highlighted, so then we had to start setting up custom identifiers for variables separate from where they were declared. So that was done, and then we had with these ones, the IO path stuff weren't working, so again, we were working through that. I think at some point I stopped and took a break, because this seems to be where, just because I'd gone through so many changes, I wasn't clear that it was sort of keeping up to date with the current state of my language file. So then I gave it an upload of the language file at that current state, just to say, hey, here's where we're currently at. I have the number 2 literal highlighting correctly, but vpath does not highlight. And so it started giving me some suggestions. I think at this point I may have been trying to highlight the hash in the same color as the variable name or as the literal. I changed my mind on that at some point in this conversation, and I just have the hash being highlighted in white. The vpath is in yellow and the 2 is in like greeny yellow. But that was also another reason why I would occasionally re-upload my current language version, just so it saw it should have a reference to what I had. Oh, and also at some point, I think around here, yes, because this is the first time I start to see this. I also got annoyed. I can't find it. It definitely is further up the screen. I just didn't notice it as we were going through this. I hadn't noticed, I don't know if this was a change to Gemini in recent times or it's just something that I hadn't noticed before, but it's the same thing that if you go to my ChatGPT best practices from my Modern Democracy video channel, I'll put a link to that as well in the description if I can remember as well. One of the things that annoys me about ChatGPT and large language models in general is the default way that they're configured is that there's a lot of language that they use to appeal to the emotional side of people, and I treat this like a machine tool. This is something that I give it the information I want and expect a result back. I don't want it to feel like I'm talking to a person. I want it to feel like I'm interacting with a machine. And so it would say things like good point or good catch and that sort of stuff. And definitely further up in the conversation, that's there. So at this point, I went and updated my preferences in Gemini, which is down in the bottom. You'll see a settings and help. If you click that, there's an instructions for Gemini here. And in that, I pasted in the same text that I have that you can find in the description of the best practices video. So again, I'll try to remember that, but let me go back to my conversation here. Okay, so then, after I made those changes, one, it stopped giving those emotional responses, and the other thing that it did was it gave me the suggested next prompts, which, again, I'm not sure why it's putting it in an array. ChatGPT doesn't do that with these same instructions. What is the next section of grammar I should review as a prompt? That's not very useful. So this is coming from my one of my instructions that I give ChatGPT is at the end of your response, suggest to me what my next prompt should be based on the flow of the conversation. And I usually get a pretty useful prompt, even if it's not something that I want to follow. I do find some value in that. And I haven't got the same results from Gemini for some reason. I'll have to dig into that, but that'll be for a different time. All right, so now I moved on to my next issue, saying that some other symbols weren't highlighting, so then we went and did some more changes. We're now down about halfway. I also noticed it started giving me the whole document every now and then for some reason. I'm not sure why it was doing that. And then it was also, so again, when I was having problems about the order of things. Oh yeah, it said, is this where it started doing this? This is another little weird thing that it would do. It said several fixes from previous steps, including base and on error, were reverted or lost. I will restore those for completeness. I did not ask it to do this, and I did not like that it was doing this because I had made a couple of changes on my own. Or again, the on error was one where I don't think I told it that I wanted on and error to be treated separately, but I had done that, and in the source code that I uploaded, it didn't match what it thought it should be, and so it started suggesting changes to do it the way that it wanted. Anyway, I would, if I was doing this again, I might have included in a follow-up prompt when I decided to make those changes myself to tell it that I was making those changes and why, so that it would stop doing that. But anyway, it was just one of those little, well, that's weird. I don't want you to. Sometimes it would give me more than I wanted or suggest things that I didn't want suggested. But in general, it was quite good. Oh yeah. So that's where I actually told it here. It said, as for the base, it is working correctly, but I forgot to tell you that I changed it on my own, and I also changed on error on my own, and they cannot be joined together because on variable is also valid, and binding on with error prevents that condition. So then, I think it stopped trying to suggest that after the fact, but I guess I wouldn't get that if I had actually told it so if you are working with a model on code and you make changes outside of the conversation, it's generally a good tip to let it know just so that it follows along and doesn't start telling you things. You don't get out of sync, I guess. Even if you just upload the file and say, this is what I want, because the conversation context doesn't include why you change things. Sometimes letting it know is a helpful little tip. Again, this is where it would start doing the full updated language file for some reason. Not sure why. Didn't seem to impact the accuracy of what it said, although, I am certainly mindful of having your context window not get too big, or else I know that the model can start to get a little bit wonky, but it seems to be with Gemini, as long as the conversation I'm focusing on, as long as I'm sort of keeping the details of what it is that I want to work on within the context of an individual prompt, it seems to not cause too much of an error, even though I'm pretty sure that by the length of this conversation, I'm pretty sure I've gone well past what the recommended context window would be for a conversation. But for some, at least for the experience in this one test, I didn't have too much of an issue as long as I was kind of keeping my prompts focused on 1 or 2 errors at a time. Didn't seem to be too much of an issue for whatever reason. By this point in the conversation, again, we're now 2/3 or so down the conversation page, we were really fine-grained. Almost everything was highlighting correctly, and now I was just honing in on the 1 or 2 individual characters or blocks of text that weren't being highlighted correctly, and we were just kind of working through those. Sometimes it wouldn't do the right, it would give me a suggestion, but it didn't work. And then it would give me, again, I don't know why I kept giving this. So it would give me a change, and then it would say, okay, here's the full document. Don't want the full document. I want to work in piecemeal. So maybe that'll be a modification I do to my custom instructions for Google Gemini if this is a workflow that I use more regularly in the future. Now, I did notice, though, that the issue may have been related to the fact that it was in a print to statement, whereas the plus symbol, so I was noticing a discrepancy where this plus wasn't highlighting, but this one was. So that was, again, where it was getting to the same token through a couple of different patterns. So this one would have been through the IO, whereas this one would have been through the variable pattern in the repository. So that was where we had to do some fixes. So then it gave me options for, and I think that was a reordering because it was doing, it was adding patterns to the IO statement. So the IO statement wasn't doing field access or operators. So by adding those 2 in, it would then, after it started with one of the IO statements, it would then look for any of the other pieces that were in there and highlight it. So even though there was a pattern within the repository for those symbols, it wasn't being referenced in the patterns for the pattern of IO statements. So anyway, things like that. That's where TextMate is kind of recursive, and learning that was part of my learning curve on this. And then the last one, I think one of the last ones was the fact that variable names needed to end with $. And that one actually took a little bit of back and forth. It kept trying to do, and it was definitely part of the same thing where that /B was an issue. And so then I gave it, so the suggestion it gave me didn't work. So then I said, okay, look, let's just make sure it knows, here's the current language thing. This is my latest version, and I want to add support for variables and type fields ending with a $. So this field could be a string, this could be a string. And that's partly because it can be a shorthand. You don't actually need to use the :string if you create your variable name with the $sign at the end. It's automatically a string from basic 09. Yeah, so just adding that to the end of the regex like this didn't work because there was a /B outside of the parentheses here. So this is the pattern matching. Parentheses in regex says anything within a parentheses is match, and then you can operate on that value, that string value that is matched, to do other things. And so it was matching on this, but even though the /B was outside of this parentheses, it was still affecting whether the $sign was part of the block, because block is just essentially these characters. These are the only characters that are valid in a pattern matching when you wrap that pattern matching with the /B's. So there's some back and forth, and it took a while for it to figure that out, because again, there's that /B, that's the problem. And then, so this colon wasn't being highlighted, so that got fixed. And I think we're pretty close to the bottom now. Here's the end result. So this is the TextMate project. So inside of the syntaxes folder, there's this basic 09 tmlanguage.json file. This is the final result. So I've got all of my patterns. I've got comments, keywords, declarations, field access, IO statements, functions, constants, IO handles, data types, strings, numbers, variables, operators, and delimiters. So that's all in the patterns that are sort of handled at the top level. And then inside of the repository, we've got references for entries for each one of those, so comments and so on. And like you can see, some of these have gotten pretty, especially with like declarations. So procedure type in particular has quite a bit of complexity to it. You can see all these different matching. Same thing with dim and params. It can get fairly complicated, including this nesting. and so on and so forth. So we got field types, IO statements, functions, constants. So again, I will make all of this available if you want to look at this yourself. But here I will show you what the end result looks like. So now if you go down here, you probably, unless you have a really high resolution, you might not see this, but it says basic 09. So now I have built into my VS Code a language support for basic 09. So if I open a file with B09 as the extension, it will use my TextMate highlighting grammar as the highlight for the language. So now I've got nice typing, so all of the sort of reserved words are all in purple, procedures themselves are in purple, variable names and field names are all in this sort of a light yellow, data types are in this green, literals are in this sort of greeny yellow, comments are all sort of grayed out, and this is true throughout the entirety of the document. So no matter which one I look at, oh, this didn't happen. Interesting. Let's switch. Oh, because I got the wrong basic 09. There we go. Anything that's commented is commented out, and everything else is nice, and the strings are nice and blue. It just makes reading code so much easier. So if you don't have it the right syntax highlighting, it becomes harder to read your source code. So again, big value for me going ahead. It's nice to actually have that support in VS Code. And all it took was a day's worth of work on a model, of having it do all the heavy lifting and me just poking and prodding it and getting it to make tweaks and changes and giving it feedback on the results of what it tells me to do and then troubleshooting the problems. It's simple. So there you go. That is a example of how to use a large language model to write code for you, specifically for TextMate. But again, you can use this sort of approach for all sorts of things. Oh, and I already see now I've got a couple of things I'll have to fix. Right, len and resume. Those should probably be purple, but that's okay. Like I said, I'll do some tweaks and update that repository as I discover new bugs. But like I said, 99% of functionality correct for Basic 09, all done in the space of less than a few hours, which was. If I had been doing this, like I said, I didn't know TextMate starting this. I didn't know how to build TextMate support into VS Code, or how to build the project to be able to set this all up. I got walked through all of it with Google Gemini because again, it knows all of this sort of stuff. So I learned, I am now a, early understand. I have at least a rudimentary understanding of how TextMate works and how TextMate is integrated into VS Code for language support. And I have a fully functional language, brand new language now that nobody had a language support for in any sort of sense. Now is there out in the wild for anybody to use. This is how large language models accelerate developer productivity and have completely transformed the way that I look at coding. So thanks for watching. I hope that wasn't too long of a spiel, but like I said, I just kind of wanted to give a nice overview and tutorial on how to use a large language model to write, to do development in the modern day. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.